Welcome back to Information Systems and Cybersecurity 375. Today we're going to talk about cybersecurity, which I think is perhaps one of the most important topics that we cover in this course. Why is it so important? Well, for one thing, we have a moral obligation to protect the privacy of our users, and we have a moral obligation to our clients to maintain a website that's available and doesn't fail. So we need to do our due diligence to make sure that our website is going to run, it's going to run correctly, and it's not going to leak sensitive information. We also have a legal obligation to make sure that our website is secure. So there are a lot of different federal regulations that are involved in this. For example, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. If we're in higher education, the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, we have to protect records from being disclosed to people who aren't supposed to have access to them. If we're working with health records or medical records, we have to follow HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. We also have to follow other federal regulations, especially if we're handling financial information. So if we're going to take credit cards, we have to be PCI CSS compliant. So there's a lot of sensitive information that we're dealing with. We have a moral and legal obligation to protect that information. Another reason that this is important is that if we don't protect that information, we could incur a financial loss. This is really particularly important for large e-commerce sites. If you're Amazon, then you're doing billions of dollars of business every week, probably every day actually, if you're Amazon. If you go down for a couple hours and people can't get to your site, you're losing a lot of sales, and that adds up to a lot of money. So there's a huge financial loss for those big sites. But even for smaller sites, if we're compromised, there's a big financial risk. Perhaps the information that we disclose could be used by a competitor to undermine our sales. Or perhaps we're going to be sued because we've leaked private information. Or maybe it's even something simpler than that. Because we have a security vulnerability, somebody can buy product for free and not pay us the money, but we're out the shipping and the cost of the items. So there's a financial incentive to protect our websites from cyber threats. There's also the loss of reputation. And websites that are compromised, that reflects poorly on the company that has that website, and that can lead to more financial loss, but also other kinds of complications. So we care a lot about cybersecurity. It's really important, but it's also very difficult. It's difficult because an attacker just has to find one hole in our security. They just have to find one vulnerability that they can compromise. We have to defend against all of the possible attacks, all of the possible threats, and we're never going to win that battle. So what can we do? Well, we can make sure that we've blocked as many potential attacks, as many potential threats as we can. And so we're going to do that. We're going to find ways to lock down our site and to be as little exposed as possible. Another reason that this is difficult, though, is that it's often really hard to find vulnerabilities. A lot of software vulnerabilities come from bugs in the code, and they're usually hard to find. If they weren't hard to find, we would have found them when we were developing the product and we would have fixed them. So they tend to be really obscure corner cases. We didn't check whether this value could be negative, and now somebody can exploit that to withdraw money instead of depositing money. Or we didn't think about what if this variable was actually a different type. Maybe we assumed it was a string, but it might be an integer. If they put a number in, something bad happens. Or we assumed it was a number, but if they type in Bob, something bad happens. So there's lots of different things that we have to think about, and they're not the things that we usually think about when we're developing software. If they were, we would have fixed them. A particular problem here is that sometimes the vulnerabilities are in software that we didn't write. In fact, most of the time, we're going to be relying on software that somebody else wrote, a database that somebody else wrote, an encryption library that somebody else wrote, a library for storing information in files, a library for displaying things in a certain way using CSS and JavaScript. And we don't have a lot of control over the vulnerabilities in that code. We're going to have to wait until somebody else fixes the bug, until they release a patch that we can download and apply that fixes that vulnerability. And so we're dependent on the developer of that third-party software. Well, the way that this usually works is that an attacker will discover some vulnerability in a piece of software, and they will exploit it. And eventually someone will realize, oh, there's a problem here, and they'll contact the developer, and the developer will develop a patch, And then time goes by because they test the patch to see that it actually works and that it doesn't break anything else. And when they've got it developed and they've tested it, then they have to distribute it to everybody else who's using that software. And all of that takes time. So we have a system that we use for keeping track of how long it takes to patch those bugs, and it's the day system. So the first day that a vulnerability is reported is day 1, and every day that goes by becomes day 2, day 3, day 4, until we release a patch for that software. So there's this sort of arms race. We patch a bug, the attackers find a new one. We patch that bug, days go by, we test, we release, the attackers find a new one, and there's this constant cycle. A particular problem are what are called zero-day exploits. Those are exploits that the attackers have identified, but we haven't come up with a patch for them yet. We haven't released a patch because we don't even know that the bug exists yet, right? The attacker does, but we don't. So zero-day exploits we can't patch because we don't know that they exist, so they're especially dangerous. Another reason that patching security problems is difficult is that it's not always, or even usually, a technical problem. More often, it's a social engineering problem. It's a problem with human beings and how they interact with the software. So even if we have a completely secure system from a technical point of view, if one of our employees or clients can be tricked into releasing sensitive information, then it doesn't really help to have all of this extra security. Another thing that can happen, though, is that we can have a policy in place that protects our network. And it can be an effective policy. But if it makes it hard for users to do their jobs, they might circumvent it. A good example of this is that when I was at William & Mary, there was a story that went around about a particular professor who wanted to be able to bring a wireless router in and connect it to the campus network. And so he would bring in a wireless router to his office. Now, we had a policy that said, you don't do that. You use the campus wireless network that we provide, but you don't bring in your own wireless router. Well, what would happen is campus IT would watch his network traffic, and they would see certain routing traffic coming from his office connection, and they would realize, oh, there's a wireless router in that office. So they would come up and they would search his office and find the router and confiscate it. And a few weeks later, he would get a new one, bring it in, conceal it somewhere in his office, and start using it again. And campus IT would realize that there was a wireless router on the network. They would go back, search his office again, find the hiding place where he'd hidden it, and then confiscate it again. And eventually, he got very creative at hiding this wireless router. They spent hours searching for it until they finally realized that the palm tree in his office had a network cable coming out of the bottom. He had buried the wireless router underneath a potted plant. True story, or at least true rumor from William & Mary days. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that you have to deal with. Human beings are fallible. They want access to resources to be easy and quick, and so they will sometimes circumvent your security policies. And so one of the quick takeaways from this is that it's important not just to think about how to make the network more secure, but also how to make it easy for users to follow the security policy, because they want to be able to do useful work, and if you make it too difficult for them to work, they will circumvent it. So I'm going to break down security into 7 separate domains that we can talk about, because it's a very, very big topic. In fact, when I teach my cybersecurity class, it takes us an entire semester to cover just an introduction to most of these topics. So I'm going to give you a smattering of 7 different domains, give you some idea of how this works, and how all the other things we've done this semester sort of fit into this security context. So let's start by talking about physical security. What is the physical security domain? Well, an attack against physical security involves direct in-person manipulation of the hardware. So if I can sit down at your server, there are a whole bunch of attacks that I can do that I don't have access to if I'm attacking you remotely over the network. For example, I can use a hardware keylogger. A keylogger is a device that I can connect a keyboard to, and then I can plug it into the computer, and it records every key that's typed on that keyboard. So when you come to your computer, you sit down, the keylogger's usually in the back of the system where you don't see it, so you don't know anything's wrong. You log in, and now I have your password because I've recorded it in my keylogger. A week later, I come by, I unplug your keyboard from the keylogger, plug it back into the computer, put the keylogger in my pocket, I walk off, I go home, and now I look at all the things you've typed, and I can see passwords, credit card numbers, private communications with your girlfriend or boyfriend, anything that you've typed, I now have a record of. So there's all sorts of sensitive information that I can get access to if I have direct access to your hardware that I wouldn't have access to otherwise. Similarly, if I have direct access to the system, I might be able to open up the case and tamper with the hardware. I could steal some of your memory, or I could embed a chip inside the computer that does location tracking or other kinds of things that I wouldn't be able to do if I weren't there in person. So it's really important to protect physical security. There's lots of things we can do to protect physical security. We can add case locks. There's a special kind of lock called a Kensington lock, and most modern desktop systems, and actually most modern laptops too, have a way that you can hook up a lock that will prevent someone from opening up the computer case. We can use security cameras. We can actually protect access to the room that our equipment is in. We can use maybe ID cards or some sort of biometric scanner to prevent access from unauthorized persons. We can use security guards. This is sometimes called men with guns. We can post men with guns outside the door to make sure that the people who are coming in are the people who are supposed to have access. If we have really, really sensitive information, perhaps we're at a military installation or maybe a bank, we can use what are called computer vaults. They're a lot like bank vaults. You know, you get a foot of thick steel all the way around your server room. The difference is that when we have computers, they produce a lot of heat, and so we need some way to vent the hot air out of the vault. So computer vaults are specifically designed to have a ventilation system that will remove the heat and provide power while still providing some serious protection for our data. We can use hard drive encryption. If we encrypt the data on the hard drive, even if someone can get access to the case and yank the hard drive out of the system and go home with it, they're going to have a hard time getting access to the data because they have to decrypt it first. And actually, a lot of hard drive encryption has a limited number of attempts. If you type in the wrong passphrase or password too many times, it'll often scramble the data, locking the drive so that you can't access it anymore, even if you had the correct credentials. We can configure the BIOS and UEFI settings. These are the settings for the hardware. When you boot a computer, you can usually press a key to get into a menu that configures which devices the system boots from and whether there's a password needed to reboot the system, things like this. If we lock down those settings, we can make it much harder for someone who has physical access to compromise our data. In particular, we want to make sure that they can't just boot off of whatever flash drive they bring in with them or some external media. We can set the system so it always boots off the hard drive, the internal hard drive. Another thing that's really important, so important in fact that I've put it in bold, is to properly dispose of data before we auction off an old system or destroy it and send it to the dumpster. So when we replace a system with a new one, we have to properly erase the data. Most of you probably know that if you just drag something to the recycle bin, it doesn't get deleted. Even if you empty your recycle bin, the data doesn't actually get deleted. What happens is that it's deleted from a list of files on your hard drive. The data is still there. It just doesn't show up in that list of files. So someone who knows how to put it back in the list or to scan for certain kinds of file formats with a tool like Scalpel or Foremost, they can find that data and retrieve it. So before you sell off your system, you should remove the hard drive. Before you dispose of the hard drives, you should either smash them into little bits with a ball peen hammer or a shredder, or you should degauss it or write random garbage over it enough times that that data can't be retrieved. Another domain of security is human security. This is sometimes called social engineering. Social engineering attacks involve the use of deception to gain unauthorized access to a system. Good example of this, I have a neighbor. She got a phone call. The guy at the end of the line said, hey, your computer has a virus, and we can help you get it off your computer, but you need to do something about this. And so she gave them her credit card number, and they charged her $200, which actually she got off pretty light, because $200 is not the most I've heard someone losing over a scam like this. And they walked her through some steps that were supposed to fix her system, but actually installed malware on her computer that allowed them to access it remotely and get access to her online banking credentials. She eventually asked me for help, and I came across the street and changed all her passwords and reset a bunch of stuff, and she's okay. But she did lose the $200. Humans are often the weakest element in their security chain because not everybody is comfortable on a computer, not everybody understands cybersecurity threats, and the attackers are very, very clever. So probably the most common social engineering attacks are these three that I've listed here. Phishing, which is the use of email to engage in social engineering. And I'm sure you've seen all sorts of phishing emails. The Nigerian prince scam. I am a lost Nigerian prince, and I want to give you $2 million, but you have to send me $5,000 first so that I can fill out all the paperwork or whatever. A lot of phishing attacks like that, mortgage scams, lots of things where they want to try to steal your identity by getting you to buy a product really cheap. A particular kind of phishing that is even more dangerous is something called spear phishing. The idea here is instead of just sending out an email to a whole bunch of people and hoping someone clicks on a malicious link and installs malware on their system, I'm actually going to target that phishing email at a particular organization or maybe even a particular person. So I'm going to go online, I'm going to do a bunch of research, and I'm going to discover, hey, there's all these students at Deep Run, and I want to target them. I want them to click on this link and install malware on their laptops. So I do some research and I find out who the principal at Deep Run is. And so I craft an email that looks like it came from Lenny Pritchard, and it says, in order to enroll for the next semester, you have to fill out this vaccination form. And now you click on the link for the vaccination form, and you don't get a vaccination form, instead you get malware. So that's spear phishing. Spear phishing attacks can be really, really clever. They can look like they're legitimate emails. I've seen some that I almost clicked on because they were that good. They almost fooled me. Another kind of phishing that's become popular is called vishing. And it's actually not a phishing attack because phishing uses email. Vishing uses voicemail. Okay, how do we protect against social engineering attacks? How do we prevent human security problems? Well, the main thing that we do is training. We try to train users how to recognize phishing emails, how to behave safely online. We also use policies. We try to implement policies that protect users from themselves and that protect our network and our systems against cyber threats. There are also some software safeguards we can use. For example, we can install ad blocking software in a web browser, and the ad blocking software can be tuned to prevent us from accessing certain malicious sites. It'll recognize, hey, this is usually a phishing website, or this is some sort of scam, don't go there. We can use firewalls and spam filters and other kinds of software devices to mitigate the chance that someone in our organization will fall victim to a social engineering attack. But ultimately, the software can only do so much. Those attacks are going to get through. We also need to train our users not to click on that link. Kind of an overarching principle that we should follow that can help protect us from the impacts of a social engineering threat are these. So first of all, the principle of least privilege says that users should be given the least amount of access required to do useful work. So if they need it to get work done, they should have permission to do it. Otherwise, they shouldn't have access to those resources. And a lot of organizations don't follow this carefully because it's too hard. They want to just, make things easy for everybody. And so they give everybody all these permissions that they don't really need. And then someone gets phished and your whole organization's vulnerable. Another thing that you need to think about is incident response. When you do get compromised, what do? How do users report incidents? If they get a suspicious email, how do they check with you whether it's a phishing email or not? How do they report that they've clicked on the link and they've been phished? If their system gets infected with malware, how do we handle that? How do we mitigate being compromised? Once we've been compromised, what steps do we take to keep the malware from spreading or to re-image the system? Who's responsible for handling incident response? Who is it that we notify? If we get compromised, do we have partners in industry that we have to notify? Do we need to notify law enforcement? What's the reporting process? Do we tell our customers that we've been compromised? And if we do, how do we do that and when and in what manner? And finally, and this one's really important, how do we close the loop? When we get compromised, how do we learn from our mistakes and adapt our policy so that we don't get compromised again? So how do we fix the broken policies and the broken software and whatever else allowed that to happen? So these are important things to consider when you're coming up with a strategy for preventing social engineering attacks. Another domain is network security. Attacks against network security are attacks against the means by which systems communicate with each other. So I've drawn a picture here that shows a typical web communication session. So I've got my client, my web browser, and it's connecting to my server over some channel. If an attacker can get access to that communication channel, There are a whole bunch of things that they can do that I really don't want to happen. For example, they can sniff the packets that are being transmitted. Now, this is really important for wireless networks. So suppose that my user is at an internet cafe or in an airport or in a hotel, and they're connecting to an untrusted wireless network. Anybody else that can get access to that can snoop their packets and see any information that they're sending. So if I don't encrypt my sensitive information, passwords, financial information, grades, whatever it is, if that's not encrypted, then they can get access to that information and they can share it with people that shouldn't have access to it. Another really dangerous problem is a man-in-the-middle attack. So it's one thing that I can snoop your data and can see information I'm not supposed to have access to, but if I can be a man in the middle, I can actually tamper with that data. So you try to log into your account and deposit $200. Well, instead you only deposit 100 and I get the other 100. Or maybe you're sending text messages to your mom and I insert images of cats or something terrible there. One of my favorite stories about this is there was a man who was really annoyed because his neighbor was stealing his Wi-Fi. And that wouldn't bother me too much, but it bothered him. So he set up something called the Squid proxy. And he set up firewall rules that would channel all of his neighbors' web traffic through the Squid proxy before it was delivered to the browser. And one of the nice things about Squid is that you can intercept the web page, parse it, and then you can transform it before you deliver it. So what he did is he took all of the images in the websites that this guy was visiting and rotated them 180 degrees so that all the images were upside down. So when this guy was browsing the web on this wireless network that he wasn't supposed to have access to, all of his pictures would be upside down. I think that's really clever. Actually, he got bored with that, and after he had done the upside down image thing for a week, he started replacing them all with cat pictures. He did a couple other things that were interesting. You can read about this if you Google like Squid upside down pictures or something like that. Anyway, that's a man-in-the-middle attack. In this case, it wasn't malicious, but it could be. Right? Someone could double bill you or steal your credit card information and impersonate you and buy things. All sorts of stuff can happen if I can get access to that communication channel and modify the packets that you're sending. E-commerce sites have to be concerned with something called the denial of service attack. Denial of service means that I can prevent you from handling requests from other users. So I might do that by causing your website to crash. Maybe I can send some malformed packet that will cause your database to crash or cause the system to crash. Or maybe just I can send so many packets that nobody else can communicate with your server. It's just so busy handling my traffic that nobody can get through. One of the particularly popular forms of DOS is something called the distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS attack, where I take a bunch of systems that have been infected with malware and they all send traffic to your server all at once so that your server can't handle anymore and people can't get through to, I don't know, buy CDs or whatever. Spoofing means that I make traffic look like it's coming from some source that it's not really coming from. So with phishing, this is really important. If I want to send you a phishing email, I don't want you to think it came from me. I want you to think it came from some legitimate source. So I'll spoof the from address of the email so it looks like it came from your boss or from some legitimate government agency or something like that. And then, of course, we have to worry about malware, viruses, worms, spyware, all these other kinds of pieces of software that infect systems on the network. How do we protect our network from these threats? Well, we have a lot of software tools that we can use. So we can use firewalls and we can use intrusion detection systems. Firewalls usually apply really simple rules. For example, block all packets from this host that I know is a bad malicious host, or block packets for this particular network service unless they come from this particular host. So don't allow email traffic unless it's coming from my email server, that kind of thing. Don't allow web traffic that's going to someone's workstation. Only allow it to go to my web server. Simple rules like that. Intrusion detection systems are a little bit more sophisticated. They look for patterns in the network traffic. And they'll say, there's this particular piece of malware, and it opens up connections on these ports. And I see a lot of traffic on those ports coming from this one system. I think it's been compromised, and now I'm going to block traffic from that system or take some other corrective action to remove the malware from that system. We should use antivirus scanners to protect our systems from malware. But the main thing that we do is patching. We download new versions of the firmware, we download new versions of the software, we perform system updates to the operating system to make sure that we aren't vulnerable to any known exploits. And by keeping our systems up to date, we're much less likely to be compromised. To prevent spoofing and man-in-the-middle attacks, it's really important to use encryption. And there's two different kinds of encryption that we use on the web. The first is what's called point-to-point encryption. This is encryption that encrypts traffic on one link of the network path. So if I am in, say, a hotel, and I'm connecting to Amazon to buy something, my internet traffic is going to go first to the hotel's wireless router, and then it's going to go to some router, and then across the internet through several hops, through several different internet service providers to Amazon. Point-to-point encryption would protect just one link in that chain. Maybe it'll just protect my connection to the wireless router. So for example, we use WPA2, the WPA2 protocol, to provide encryption over a wireless network. My traffic is encrypted to the wireless router, but then when the wireless router sends it on all the way to Amazon, it's not encrypted anymore. It's just sent in plain text. So point-to-point encryption is important, especially for wireless networks, because by nature they're broadcast. Anybody with a radio can tune in and listen to your traffic. So it has to be encrypted, but it's not sufficient. We have to do more than that because we need to protect the other links in the network path too, or our data could be intercepted. So to do that, we use what's called end-to-end encryption. And the idea is I'm going to encrypt the document that I'm sending or the web page that I'm sending or whatever request it is. I'm going to encrypt the data, and then I'm going to send it all the way to the recipient encrypted. So end-to-end encryption. And that's done at the protocol level of the network stack. So the most popular protocol for doing that on the web is HTTPS, the Secure Hypertext Transport Protocol, that uses public key encryption to encrypt your password that you're putting into a web form or the file that you're uploading. And it encrypts it, sends it across the line to the other end, and then the web server can decrypt it. We also use HTTPS for something else, actually. We use it for authentication. If someone has a rogue access point that they've set up that looks like the hotel's wireless router, but it's actually their own malicious router, they can perform man-in-the-middle attacks against your traffic. And one way that we can mitigate those man-in-the-middle attacks is by using cryptographic signatures to verify that we're actually connecting to the website we think we're connecting to, not some spoofed website that is being presented as a man-in-the-middle threat. We'll talk more about that. So how does this work? Well, there actually is one protocol that's primarily used for this, and it used to be called SSL, Secure Socket Layer, but newer versions of it now have a new name, Transaction Layer Security. This is somewhat confusing because SSL version 3 is actually older than TLS version 1.0. So you want to have TLS 1.2 or 1.3 encryption. You don't want to have SSL encryption anymore. But we still call them SSL certificates, even though the name of the protocol has changed to TLS. You need to know what both of these acronyms stand for. So SSL is the Secure Socket Layer. TLS is the Transaction Layer Security Protocol. Both of these rely on public key cryptography. What is that? Well, it's a cipher system. It's a way that we can encrypt information. And it uses two keys. It uses a private key that we keep secret. It's called the secret key or private key. Only we know the private key. But it also has another key, a public key that we publish to the world, or at least that we can publish to the world. And the private key and the public key form a pair. Anything I encrypt with the public key can only be decrypted by the private key. Anything I encrypt with the private key can only be decrypted by that public key, right? They're connected. And the advantage of this is that since only I know the secret key, anything I encrypt with the secret key can be decrypted by anybody who has the public key. So anybody can decrypt it, but they know it came from me because only I had the private key that works with that public key. On the other hand, anything encrypted with the public key can only be decrypted with my private key. So if you want to communicate with me securely, you just encrypt things with my public key and send it to me, and only I have the private key that can decrypt it. So this allows us to do two things, like I said. It allows us to communicate securely, but it also allows us to prove our identity. And the way that that's usually done is by creating something called a certificate. And a certificate is just a document that's been signed by someone's private key. And it proves that they are the owner of the website or a resource. So if someone wants to connect to my website and they want to know they're connecting to my site and not some spoofed site, they download my certificate, they download my public key, and they check that they match. And sure enough, they match, they're communicating with the correct website. Oh, wait a minute. If I can spoof the website, is there any reason I can't just spoof the public key? Well, no. And so that's not really going to prevent spoofing unless we take some additional steps. And that's where this idea of a certificate authority comes in. What is a certificate authority? Well, it's an organization that has a set of secret keys that they maintain. And they distribute those secret keys. Actually, they distribute public keys that match those secret keys with all of the major web browsers. So Firefox has a copy of the public keys. Chrome has a copy of the public keys. Edge has a copy of the public keys. So what I do, if I want to prevent my website from being spoofed, I create a certificate, I sign it with my key, and then I sign my public key with the certificate authority's private key. Now, how can I do that? I don't have their private key. Well, I send them my public key, they sign it and send it back to me, and now you can download my public key, and you can verify that it is my public key by using the certificate that comes with your browser, and the certificate authority basically guarantees that I am who I say I am. Now, a lot of these certificate authorities charge a lot of money to do this, but there are some nonprofits that do it, and the one that I prefer is something called Let's Encrypt. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has this initiative, a program called CertBot, that allows you to get free certificates for your website. So network security is important, but system security is also important. System security involves the security of the host system that's actually running our web server and our database and the other software. So these are attacks against system security are attacks against the operating environment on which a service is running. And there are a lot of different threats against the security of a host system. For example, a lot of what I see on my server are these brute force SSH attacks. Basically, the attacker wants to get into my system, and so they want to be able to log in over SSH, and so they just try a whole bunch of different passwords to try to get into the root account. Or they scan for usernames somehow, and then they discover, oh, look, student 5 is a user on the system. And so they try to log in as student 5 with a whole bunch of different passwords. And if any user on the system has set a weak password, there's a chance that they can get in. So I see a lot of that, actually. Almost every server that I've ever managed has seen just thousands of these brute force attacks every day. People trying to log in and get remote access to the system. Sometimes through SSH, sometimes through RDP, the Remote Desktop Protocol. But that's really common. Malware is another common threat because users will download stuff and run it, and if someone can embed malware on your server, well, now the attacker can get access to your system and they can compromise all the data stored in the database. Sometimes the software that you're running is vulnerable. Sometimes maybe the database that I'm using has some software bug, and if they connect to the right port and send the right information, they can do some kind of buffer overflow attack and get access to the system. And once they've done that, they usually install software called a rootkit. And a rootkit is basically just a back door. It's a way that they can get into the system even if you fix the security flaw that let them get in. Maybe you change that weak password, or you upgrade that software so that it's now patched against the vulnerability that they used. They can still get in because they've already compromised it. They've got this back door that lets them go to a certain website on your server and type in commands that they can run. Or it opens up a reverse SSH tunnel. It logs in remotely to their system, and they can send commands back to be executed. So rootkits are often really hard to find. They take a lot of steps to disguise them and hide them. Usually they put them in hidden files, and sometimes they run special code that hides them from the operating system process list. But that's usually what happens. So it's important to scan for rootkits periodically and make sure you haven't been compromised. How do we protect our systems against these threats? Well, the most important thing is to do adequate testing, and the most important kind is what's called penetration testing. Run lots of software that looks for vulnerabilities and find all the holes so that we can patch them. And then the second thing that we do is when we find a vulnerability, we make sure that we've got our system up to date, that we've applied all the security patches that we can find, and Usually that will close most of the security holes. Now, of course, it doesn't help us against zero-day exploits, but there's only so much we can do. If we have a zero-day exploit, we're going to have to do things like creating a new rule in the firewall that will protect our network and prevent them from accessing the software that has that vulnerability. But also, we should do lots of auditing and testing. Almost every piece of software that runs on a server generates log messages. And we can usually identify security anomalies by looking through those log messages for things that are a little bit different. But there's so much information, it's hard to do that by hand. There are a lot of tools that automate that process. There's Bro and Splunk, but also there are what are called SEMs, or Security Information and Event Managers, like AlienVault, that will basically collect logs from all of the systems on your network and search through it for suspicious activity, and then they'll let you know when they find something. And some of them are really, really powerful. They can actually identify particular pieces of malware that are running or particular software that's been compromised, and give you some suggested actions to take to block it.